At the time, Kosovo was a prominent Albanian region of Serbia, which had a deep and complex history regarding its autonomy and identity. By the mid-1990s, a guerrilla campaign was established by the Kosovo Liberation Army, KLA, and was well underway. This was a direct result of Albanian leaders declaring independence, a rise in ethnic tensions and civil unrest. Tensions further increased in the March of 1998, when Serb forces rolled into the Kosovan village of Prekaz, using tanks and armoured personnel carriers. The target was the family of Adem Jesari, the founder of the KLA, and the house was levelled, killing all inside. 57 members of the Jesari family in total. The Prekaz massacre was reported by the world's media and changed international opinion, especially regarding the KLA as a terrorist organisation. The KLA made good use of the multimedia advances, such as the Internet, to successfully report their persecution, and this gained them more international support over the Serbs. The murder of the Jesari family had also inspired thousands of young Albanians who had rallied to join the ranks of the KLA, and this unfortunately incited further Serbian acts of genocide. In January 1999, more massacres were reported outside the village of Rakak, when 45 Albanians were found dead after another Serb attack. The UN feared a repeat of Bosnia and the atrocities that could have been prevented there with more decisive military interventions, such as the Srebrenica massacre. There was still one main obstacle to overcome, and that was that Serbia had the support from Moscow, and this only raised international tensions further, with the terrifying prospect of an all-out war with Russia. After the peace talks had stalled between Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic and the UN to halt the ethnic cleansing of the Albanians, diplomacy had fundamentally failed. So as a result, military action was authorized. After all, war is essentially an extension of diplomatic failure. In the March, an air campaign began to target military and strategic targets in Belgrade to put additional pressure on Milosevic. Then, in the May, and after months of frustration, we would finally get the call to deploy. Occasionally, we would be tasked to patrol the mountains to the north, bordering the region of Kosovo, and we had a front-row seat to watch the ongoing bombing campaign against the Serbian military and strategic targets. These mountains were a sight of natural beauty, and I remember watching the most stunning sunset from this elevated location before the main event, which would be observing the Allied bombing of Serb military targets in the distance. A US F-117 stealth fighter had previously been shot down by a Russian SA-3 Goa surface-to-air missile, and this only made these border patrols more intense, as these planes were supposed to be hidden from radar. These patrols never frightened me, and throughout my time in Macedonia, I don't recall any of our platoon being afraid, for that matter. We were well trained, and we were actually looking forward to finally being able to put our training to the test. By early June, our training was stepped up, and we began more aggressive drills such as bayonet fighting. Every man went through this, even the vehicle crews, and this prepared us psychologically to kill the enemy, and, let us not forget, to dehumanize them. We were preparing for war, and this is what our training always consisted of. It was physically brutal, as the ethos at the time was to train hard, to fight easy. I remember that no training was conducted to provide any form of humanitarian relief, and little language training was provided, as we were all allocated interpreters. Everything was now conducted at a high-tempo pace, with the focus being on aggression, fighting through, and different ways of killing the enemy. I recall that we were all pumped, wound up, and ready to be unleashed. We were dogs of war. We were ready, well-trained, drilled, and mentally focused for the battle to come. Our mission and training were primarily focused on defeating the Serbian forces in the region of Kosovo. We had been training aggressively for this, and when the mission began to change to a more peacekeeping task, all of us felt a sense of underwhelming disappointment. We were all young men who had undergone years of behavioral training, conditioning to go to war, to defeat the evil enemy. We wholeheartedly believed that we were the good guys, and were willing to participate in aggressive military action, as we all undoubtedly believed in our mission to save the Kosovo people. We'd been given daily briefs on the ethnic cleansing, and one must remember that we were still living in a bipolar world, where the remnants and scars of the Cold War were still at large. There was still a great deal of international tension, and a distinct lack of trust between East and West, and the Kosovo crisis could quite easily have been the powder keg to start another war. We received our orders to deploy into Kosovo on the morning of the 12th of June, and after months of preparations, we were moved from the cover of the Petrovic woods and leaguered up into neat military columns. I recall being in awe of the military might that was now on show, and that the air was swarming with helicopters. This was a multinational operation, and we were the main effort to secure the roundabout at the southeastern access point to Pristina, but were starting at the rear. The plan was to peel in, so that we would be fresh from any fighting once we arrived on the outskirts of the Kosovo capital. Once we were in position, we received a motivational speech from our commanding officer, before having a battalion blessing from the Padre. I found this prayer before battle quite hypocritical, as many soldiers who rarely took religion seriously were now praying because their lives were in imminent danger. Some soldiers were only religious in times of need, which was a concept that I couldn't really buy into. Our route was to drive along the E65 Macedonian highway into Pristina, and we were greeted with Albanian refugees as we passed through Skopje, waving us on and supporting us from the side of the road and on bridges. This gave us enormous pride and added purpose. We had a wealth of operational experience within the platoon that ranged from the 1991 Gulf War and Bosnia to Northern Ireland. But none of us had ever experienced anything like this. As we left Macedonia and entered the Serbian Kekanic Gorge, a mountainous valley, our armoured columns suddenly felt extremely vulnerable. Fortunately, we had elite soldiers from the Parachute Regiment and the Royal Gurkha Rifles flown in by helicopters to provide flank protection for our armoured vehicles. We were constantly delayed by Serbian mines and obstacles that had to be cleared by the Royal Engineers, and this was a very tense time, as we were static and open to attack. It was 15:30 hours by the time we finally passed through the potentially lethal Kekanic Gorge, and I was relieved. The tunnels were crumbling from the inside and had no light, whereas the bridges barely forded the weight of the armoured vehicles. It was a feat in itself just to get the armour along this decaying and dangerous mountainous route. In fact, the Royal Engineers had to build several bridges for us to use, as the current ones were not sufficient or safe enough for our heavy vehicles. If we had been forced to fight our way through this valley, then we would have taken an immense number of casualties, and if defended properly, then possibly we would have not made it at all. I wrote in my diary that I had hoped to have entered Kosovo aggressively with Serbian resistance, but after seeing the landscape, the reality of this made me cold and shiver. I wrote that I was relieved that we were entering as a peacekeeping force due to the nature of this landscape. As we entered the former Yugoslavia, there was an eerie ambience, as there was no signs of life in the neighbouring villages and towns. Cars were burnt out, and buildings demolished. What had happened here? As the ground levelled out, we were fast approaching our goal, Pristina, which was now only 50 kilometres away, when the heavens opened. This was not just any rain, but a tropical thunderstorm, which reduced our visibility and resulted in the convoy slowing down. About 30 kilometres out, the convoy came to a halt as the third section in 10 platoon, warrior call sign 1-3, had crashed into a truck. However, this wasn't just any truck, but a Serb military truck, full of landmines. The truck swayed off the road and crashed with the impact from the armoured warrior. Then all of the occupants, Serbian soldiers, fled in fear for their lives. All of our infantry dismounted, but not before they were reminded not to stray off the hard standing of the road because of the danger of landmines. The irony, it would seem, that nowhere was safe from the Serbian mines. Just after 2200 hours, we received new orders to go firm for the evening. It seemed as if our mission parameters were changing hourly. The plan now was to take Pristina the following morning at first light. We were only 20 kilometres away, and we could visibly observe the lights of the capital in the distance. Throughout the night, Serbian forces would pass us, heading north with the occasional T-54-55 main battle tank aiming its cannon at us. If one single soldier lost their nerve and engaged these forces, then it would have started an all-out war. Thankfully, and despite the tension, we all kept our cool. In my diary, I noted that these military convoys were also accompanied by civilian vehicles from some of the Serbian population. These civilians were fearful of repercussions from the returning Albanians, as well as from us NATO soldiers, and sought refuge within mainland Serbia. Our interpreter explained that the Serbian-affiliated population of Pristina had evacuated the city the previous day, and at the time, I didn't really understand why. But in the following months, it would become all too clear. After breakfast on the 13th of June, we mounted up and drove at speed to Pristina, only to be halted by some Italians who were blocking our advance. The radio was filled with slightly racist phrases, such as, "Get these fucking spaghetti eaters out of the road," as our goal was to be the first into Pristina, and the race was on. When we arrived at our roundabout, the 3 platoons of No. 4 Company tactically manoeuvred into our pre-planned and rehearsed positions in all-round defence and secured the large roundabout at the southern entrance to Pristina. We were surrounded by the world's press. They'd been there waiting for us since the previous day, but the heavy rain had delayed our advance. This didn't really seem like an aggressive land advance if the press were already waiting for us. But we still had a job to do, and there was still danger lurking everywhere. Then the plan changed yet again. Our company commander screamed on the radio for us to withdraw, as the city had not been cleared for entry, and that we shouldn't have secured the roundabout. Most units who were involved in the liberation of Kosovo will take credit and boast that they were the first NATO forces into Pristina. I'm not bold enough to make such a claim, but the men of No. 4 Company were certainly in contention for such a military accolade. We withdrew to the outskirts of the city. The company commander gave us all a brief in person, informing us that the situation was continuously evolving. Our new orders were to secure the main supply route through Pristina. However, by now, Some of the withdrawing Serbian forces were becoming aggressive and were attempting to antagonize us by firing small arms wildly at us in our general direction. We were now informed that our mission was to force the Serb forces out of Pristina and to secure Kosovo for its future people. Chapter 5. Kosovo now. The time had come. I mounted up, climbed into my driver's cab and flicked the power switches on my driver's instrument panel before flicking the starting motor and powering up the engine. The 17.4-litre engine roared and seemed almost as excited as I was. This was the big moment. We were about to liberate a nation from oppression, and the whole world was watching. The radio was full of chatter as we made our way along the main road to Pristina. This was a beautiful city, full of history and culture, and could have been any number of cities in Eastern Europe. But something was amiss. Where were the people? This city was a ghost town, and the only signs of life were the odd stray dog. Bullet holes decorated the fronts of all of the buildings, and burnt-out cars littered the streets. This was something one might expect from the apocalypse, and it certainly felt like it was just that. There was an eerie feel about our presence there. As we cautiously patrolled through the abandoned streets, Soldier B and Wade observed from the top of the turret for any hostilities. But there's nobody around. Pristina was deserted. It was a ghost town. It was only 0900 when we eventually came to a halt at the north of the city at the junction of the historic Ottoman Jamia al-Lapid Mosque. 10 Platoon had led the way through the city. At this point, I remember thinking to myself, where the hell is everyone? Then the order came across the radio for us all to go firm and to replace our helmets with berets. This made no sense to me at the time, as Serb forces were still extracting and taking the occasional potshot at us. Looking back, the strategic thinking behind this was to make us appear less aggressive and to de-escalate the tense situation that all of us were in. The air campaign had destroyed all of the Serbian communications, and it would be weeks before all of them would be successfully withdrawn. Some Serb troops didn't even know that we were coming. Furthermore, NATO forces had bypassed thousands of Serb troops on our advance to Pristina, and without prior knowledge of our arrival, it's a miracle that all soldiers on both sides kept their cool. Personally, I was in full-on warfighting mode, and didn't trust anyone who wasn't wearing a British flag on their arm. Then there was movement from a sewer to our rear. I grabbed my assault rifle and made my way to the top of our warrior. I hated being static in the built-up area, as I was ineffective in my driver's cab. Concurrently, our infantry section dismounted to provide us with some protection for the impending threat. To our surprise, an Albanian family emerged in tears to greet us. God knows how long they'd been living down there, hiding in fear of their lives. Then more and more Albanians began to emerge from their refuge and began to emotionally break down in tears before us. These people had been oppressed, beaten, and murdered because of their ethnicity, and we were in the process of liberating them. An excited young male then attempted to climb onto my warrior and was met with my size 10 boot. I didn't like this situation, as we were all distracted from the real threat, and that was the withdrawing Serb forces. We didn't know who to trust, and none of us knew what to do, as we had trained hard for the past 6 months for war, and now we were in the center of a humanitarian mission. It was difficult not to be overwhelmed with the joyous and euphoric ambience, but we were disciplined soldiers and still had a job to do. We were being greeted like rock stars, heroes, but the mission parameters were still fluctuating, and this put enormous pressure on all of us. Soldiers like to plan for all eventualities, yet we had not anticipated this current scenario. We had trained relentlessly for war, and now we were greeted with peaceful, indebted crowds of Albanians. We were liberators, and this was hard to process for our pre-programmed infantry mindset. I have no idea where all of those pink flowers came from, but within minutes my warrior armoured fighting vehicle was completely covered in them, and it resembled a parade float that wouldn't be out of place at Pride. The Albanians were overcome with happiness and joy and began to cheer, then sing. Some offered gifts such as their watches and jewellery, which we obviously refused. These people had nothing, but were so thankful for the small part that 10 Platoon had played in their freedom, that they were offering us all they had in unconditional gestures. The crowd then began to grow and intensified even more as some KLA freedom fighters wearing UCK insignia emerged. I didn't completely trust the KLA, but we were there to help them, and one must not forget that they played a key role in Kosovo's liberation. It was no coincidence that as the KLA emerged, we could hear gunshots and small battles that were now ongoing from within the city. It was time to move, investigate and secure Pristina. The KLA made our mission more difficult as they persisted in ambushing the withdrawing Serbian forces at every opportunity, which was against the peace agreement that had been brokered days earlier. This put all of us on edge as we didn't trust the KLA, and I don't really think they trusted us in return. Then as we began our investigation, I recall that we were patrolling through a residential area of the city when we were forced to come to a halt due to a roadblock of cars that had created a killing zone to our immediate front. To our right-hand side, where once stood 2 small houses, was a Serbian T-54-55 main battle tank that was pointing its main 100mm armament directly at us. Wade immediately commanded Soldier B to aim our 30mm cannon towards this main battle tank in a show of equal force. But Soldier B responded with the words, "Paul, get us out of here! Drive!" I put my boot to the metal and easily drove over 2 small cars, then over a tractor before clipping the side of a small shop. Soldier B and I didn't fancy getting hit with a 100mm tank shell at close range, and I think that Wade was also relieved by Soldier B's quick thinking. We eventually met up with some fellow Irish guardsmen from another company who were providing first aid to some Serb soldiers who had been shot up by the KLA whilst looting. One of these was clearly dead, and a quarter of his skull was missing on the right-hand side. The bullet had left a hole that I imagined could have easily been caused by a large axe, and this was completely different from the previous head wound that I'd witnessed some years earlier in training. Regardless, he was dead, and we had to take the body to the morgue at the hospital. We wrapped this soldier in a poncho, and Soldier B and I launched him into the crew compartment in the back of the Warrior. However, we threw him with such force that he cracked his head on the corner of our boiling vessel. This made a dull thump kind of sound, where everyone goes, "Ooh," then rubs their own head acknowledging the pain. Soldier B then persisted to ask if the corpse was okay, as skull, blood and brain matter dripped from the poncho. As I drove to the morgue, I began to joke about the dead Serbian in the back of our vehicle. I was still the class clown, and insisted that he was moving, and that I could hear him screaming for help. I continued the prank and told the lads in the turret that he was clawing at their feet, and to my amazement, they were buying it. By the time that we arrived at the morgue, both Soldier B and Wade were practically sat on top of the turret out of fear of a zombie attack. Then to our amazement, shock and horror, when we opened the back door of the Warrior, this perceived zombie corpse was sat up slightly Soldier B apologised again for cracking his head off the corner of the boiling vessel, as I fixed my bayonet to make sure that he was actually dead. Now even I believed in zombies. Talk about a joke backfiring. I didn't know whether it was the vibrations from the warrior that made this zombie sit up, or if we'd gone over a bump, or maybe it was just gas within the corpse. But this was the last time I joked about the dead. The access to the morgue was at the gable end of the building through what appeared to be a fire door. There were plenty of black stretchers at this entrance, so we were at the right place. I promptly grabbed one, and Soldier B assisted as we loaded up our zombie friend. Then Soldier B asked why these stretchers were not white, and then the realization hit us both at the same time as we reluctantly advanced towards the corridor to the morgue. These stretchers were white, but had been stained with so much dead blood that they were now black. Our high morale from our proud, good-spirited morning was about to change to desolation, and all our lives would be forever changed as we entered this tomb of death. Pristina had been without power for some time, so the first thing that hit us as we approached was the ungodly smell. We could actually taste the death, chew on it. In fact, from a good distance away. The rotten smell of decomposing human flesh consumed us. Even now, writing these words, I can taste, smell, and feel the morgue. A smell so bad that it makes your skin itch, even crawl. The temperatures were well over 30 degrees Celsius that summer, and both sides of the corridors were lined from the floor to the ceiling with mainly women and young children. This left a narrow walkway only a few feet wide, so I kept my head down and tried my hardest not to look to my left and right, but I just couldn't help myself. These people had not died from natural causes. They'd been beaten, mutilated, raped, tortured, and murdered. Some were missing limbs, whereas others were burnt, or just too badly decomposed to observe their wounds to determine how they actually died. I was gagging on the smell and my eyes were watering, and I just wanted to run out of there and scream. But we still needed a place to dump this corpse. Eventually we found a widening where some doors were, and we sat down our zombie Serb. Then, almost like a moth to a flame, in my direct eyesight, there was a 10-year-old boy decomposing right in front of me. His chest cavity was non-existent, black, and was full of maggots eating away at him. I could only imagine what had inflicted such a wound. A shotgun up close, a burst from a heavy machine gun, or just maybe he had been there that long that the maggots had just eaten away at him. I had a younger brother back home around the same age, and all I could think about was that if he'd been unfortunate enough to be born in Pristina, then this could well have been his fate. Soldier B recalls becoming overwhelmed by witnessing so much death and began to lean on a shelf for support, only to find that this was not a shelf, but in fact a set of mutilated feet. I don't recall leaving the morgue that day or how we returned to the rest of the platoon, and I never wrote about this in my war journal. I didn't need to, as it has stayed with me and haunted me every day since. That afternoon, we returned to the jubilant scenes at the corner of the Ottoman Mosque, and despite the party atmosphere, I didn't feel like a liberator or a hero anymore. I felt only despair and anguish. Part of me died that day in that morgue, and I became numb and emotionless, an empty vessel. Liberating the people of Kosovo came with a lifetime of debt, of psychological suffering and pain. I was an optimistic boy that morning when we entered Pristina, and in the space of several hours I had lost faith in humanity, along with the hopes and the romantic innocence associated with my childish pursuit of warfare. This was an unwanted, unwritten truth about the darker sides of warfare that is never taught, that you can never prepare yourself for. None of us ever spoke about our experiences of that morgue to the rest of 10 Platoon, as this was our cross to bear, and we didn't want to dampen the morale of the rest of the lads, as they were still festooned with flowers, hugs and kisses from the citizens of Pristina. The very same day that we had entered the capital, the Russians had also uninvitedly landed at Pristina Airport. This could have potentially triggered an all-out war with Moscow, but they'd not landed there to fight us. They were there to protect the Serbian nationals who wanted to remain in Kosovo, and they too were greeted like heroes by the Serbian villagers, who were as much afraid of NATO as the KLA. That night the city was alive with skirmishes, looters, and the still ongoing ethnic cleansing between the factions. So as a result, none of us slept. The following day, things seemed to calm down slightly, as there were fewer Serbian troops in the capital, and we were all relieved that the Russians were very happy to work alongside us. During the following days, we would escort the remaining Serb forces out of Pristina, as they feared that the KLA would ambush them, and they were right to think this way. The KLA were becoming more and more difficult to work with, and would continue to attack Serb communities. Hence, we were caught in the middle as our mission had evolved to a more peacekeeping one. From my war journal, I noted that we escorted approximately 15 Serbian truckfuls of loot, ranging from electrical goods like TVs and stereos, to foodstuff like tuna and mayonnaise. There was a clear scorched earth policy put in place by the Serbs. What they couldn't physically take with them, they burnt or destroyed, leaving nothing for the returning Albanian refugees. In the days that followed, we made a local MUP, Serbian police station, our temporary home on the outskirts of Pristina, and were informed that the KLA were in a period of decommissioning. But this was all talk, and they never really voluntarily handed in any of their weapons. They were always patrolling their own Albanian areas and even set up their own vehicle checkpoints. We would frequently come across highly fortified buildings with AK-47s pointing out of the windows and KLA banners proudly flying high. Having a permanent base allowed me to participate in foot patrols, which I relished, and on one such patrol, I recall that we were trying to haggle for some fresh milk from a local farmer, but somehow we found ourselves in the centre of a minefield. The farmer must have confused milk with mine. We carefully and instinctively relied on our training and exited the minefield by slowly retracing our steps, and we all felt very lucky indeed. Needless to say, we never approached the locals for milk again. What was quite the spectacle, though, was that a gigantic US cruise missile had landed in this farmer's house, and he was still living there, like everything was normal, with this huge unexploded rocket sticking out of the side of his building. We reported this like it was a normal daily occurrence, then continued on our patrol. Mines were an ongoing danger in Kosovo. We had been trained prior to our deployment on all of the different variants, and we would frequently hear them exploding in the distance. This made patrolling on foot that bit more dangerous, as we could easily wander into an unmarked minefield, and this happened far too often. We had no idea where the Serbian soldiers had left their mines, as they never marked them, and neither did the returning Albanian refugees. Cattle would also be blown up by mainly anti-personnel mines, and at one stage or another, we all had to deal with civilian casualties as a result of this malicious parting gift from the Serbian soldiers. These were mostly shrapnel wounds and breaks to the lower limbs, with the bones more often than not protruding. Even back then, it was always the injuries to the children that bothered us. It was always the kids who seemed to suffer as a result of warfare. We would eventually move to a small town to the west of Pristina called Obilic, and this would be our home for the rest of the tour. Our first priority was to gain intelligence from the surrounding local villages to determine their population, ethnicity, and well-being, including food, power, and sanitation needs. I recall from my journal that the first village we patrolled through had been decimated, burnt out, destroyed. There were no bodies, but there were signs of death everywhere. Stale blood patches stained the ground. Bullet holes marked the walls, and not one building was left intact. It was obvious to us all that something bad had happened here. Something inhumane. Then the dark, squaddy humour kicked in, acting as an emotional deterrent, with Wade suggesting that a decent plasterer could make a mint here. This was by no means disrespectful, but rather a coping mechanism that allowed us to function in a demanding and emotionally overcharged situation. We all joined in with the inappropriate comments, and this helped us escape the very sombre atmosphere. I remember that the last building was a farm complex, and like the other buildings, it was in complete ruin. Thick smoke was coming from it, as it was still on fire. A tiny elderly woman then emerged. I wrote in my journal that she was filthy and hadn't washed in weeks. Her clothes were not her own, and her shoes were several sizes too big. This distraught elderly lady immediately broke down in tears and collapsed in front of us, and we knew very little of what she was saying, but we didn't need to. It was clear that she was explaining what the Serbs had done to her village. Then, from the surrounding hills, a small number of villagers emerged and tearfully greeted us. From my journal, I noted that they were so welcoming and modest. These people had lost everything, but somehow were still able to offer us hot drinks and bread. We gave the children boiled sweets and chocolate, and provided the villagers with our spare rations. It was the least we could do. I even gave my Manchester City top to a young kid who needed clothing. The villagers insisted that we ate and drank with them, and even had alcohol in the form of slivovitz, the deadliest drink known to man. I am still to this day humbled by the hospitality that we received from the Kosovo people at a time when they had lost everything and had nothing. We would frequently patrol through countless villages, and this pattern of destruction and death became our daily norm, especially around the town of Obilic. Obilic was a multi-ethnicity industrial town, and is best described by Major Bridge, the commander of D Squadron, the King's Royal Hussars, who explains the cultural makeup in the following statement. One could not be bored. Almost unique in Kosovo, the Irish Guards battle group still had large populations of Serbs and Gypsies as well as Albanians. D Squadron Group's area of operations was perhaps the most multi-ethnic of all. There was sufficient of each ethnic group to make them prepared to continue to struggle. The clashes between Serbs, Albanians and Gypsies, not forgetting Turks and Muslim Slavs, would keep us busy for the remainder of the tour. Incidents involved murder, grenade attacks, drive-by shootings, and the occasional riot. Obelich was indeed diverse, and this made our job even more unpleasant. From my diary entry on the 26th of June, I documented that we had returned to our village in our area of responsibility, and we were devastated at what we found. There had been reports of gunshots targeting the Gypsy-occupied village the previous day. The Gypsies' village consisted of poorly constructed buildings, and the sanitation ran directly through the main street. They had power, and we would always clip these makeshift cables with our warrior vehicles' antennas when passing through. The children would always greet us, and we would give them boiled sweets and rations, as they had nothing. On our previous visit, Wade had lost it when he'd caught some gypsies looting other gypsies' homes, and he really gave them a mouthful. This was the only time I saw Wade ever lose his cool. We didn't need an interpreter to get our point across, and although this was just a bollocking, these gypsies had genuine fear in their eyes and expected to be shot. Maybe because we were uniformed soldiers, they'd expected to be punished the Serbian way. But we were British, so a good telling off was as far as it went. We had patrolled the area frequently, but we had 9 villages and areas to patrol. We simply didn't have enough manpower to be everywhere at once to provide security, and once we had patrolled through a village, atrocities from different factions often followed. Due to the imminent threat to this gypsy village, we were accompanied by members of the Royal Military Police and Special Forces soldiers from the Special Air Service, SAS. We had patrolled this village in the early hours of that morning, but on our return at first light, we could see thick smoke at a distance and realised that the village was on fire. As we drove closer, we were all aware of what had happened in the several hours that we had been elsewhere. As we approached, the smoke became thicker, and we were greeted with the stench of burning flesh, the smell of death. As we patrolled through, the dismounted infantry checked the remains of the buildings that were still burning and reported gypsy corpse after gypsy corpse on the radio. The buildings that were left standing were now full of bullet holes, and all the windows had been smashed. Blood was everywhere. The gypsies had been massacred. We didn't know who exactly had committed this atrocity, but intelligence from our accompanying military policemen informed us that it was conducted by Albanians. We never found out whether this was returning refugees, or if it was, in fact, the KLA who were responsible for this massacre, and nobody was ever held to account. From my journal, I logged how we had to return back to the morgue with these burnt gypsy bodies, but I have no recollection of this, and my journal entry is brief. However, I wrote how I couldn't comprehend how people could do such atrocities to each other. I logged that the returning Albanian refugees were initially saddened at seeing their homes, livelihoods and possessions obliterated, and their friends and family members murdered at the hands of the Serbs. Their sorrow was justifiably turned into rage towards the remaining Serbian villagers, and now, as peacekeepers, our role was to protect the Serbians from the wrath of the KLA and the returning Albanian refugees. Once we became settled in Obelich, we would rotate our patrols in and around the key infrastructures of the factory, power plant, quarry and coal mine. It was at the power plant that we had our most dangerous brush with death to date. But this would come from within. 10 Platoon was being used as a battle group asset, and wherever there was trouble or tensions, we were deployed to assist. For the first 2 weeks in Kosovo, none of us had very much sleep, and this fatigue would eventually take its toll. Drivers were throwing tracks from their warriors, and soldiers were falling asleep on guard, and this was blatantly due to fatigue and operational burnout. Then, after yet another night of continuous patrols and limited sleep, On leaving the power plant for yet another village protection patrol, I heard a loud bang and screams from the back of my warrior. I instinctively opened the back door, using the button next to my driver's instrument panel, anticipating the worst, grabbed a field dressing from my med kit, and scrambled over the top of the warrior to the rear. I had expected blood everywhere, as by now it was obvious that one of the infantry dismounts had accidentally discharged his rifle in the confined space of the crew compartment, where 7 soldiers were crammed in like sardines. We were passing another section and crew from 10 platoon when this event happened, and it soon became evident that Guardsman Chambers had a negligent discharge, ND, and had accidentally fired his weapon, narrowly missing another soldier's face in the process. When I arrived at the back of my vehicle, the dismounts were all dazed and confused, and Butch, a driver from the 110 crew, had Chambers pinned to the floor and was screaming at him. We were all physically and emotionally shattered, and we could have quite easily taken our frustration out on Chambers. And Soldier B remembers that is precisely what I did. On inspecting the interior of my vehicle, it soon became apparent the bullet had penetrated several of the 94mm light anti-tank weapons. These warheads were designed to penetrate the armour of main battle tanks, and it was a miracle that they had not detonated, as everyone close by, including our sister section, would have been annihilated. As a consequence, we were now grounded until these powerful explosive rockets were deemed safe. Within hours, 2 soldiers from the Explosive Ordnance Disposal, EOD, arrived, and would later explain how fortunate we had been, as the bullet had narrowly missed 2 of the lethal warheads. As a result of this near-fatal incident, we were given some stability and routine, with a 3-day patrol cycle, followed by a day of administration and vehicle maintenance. We'd all been working 24/7, and were at breaking point, and there's only so much the human body can take. I've always been a firm believer that out of every experience, good or bad, you have to take something positive away. For 10 platoon, this near-death experience brought us stability and routine, which meant sleep, and this was a positive outcome. There are many events that happened in Kosovo that I've chosen to forget. One such event is when I went for a swim in a small lake. We didn't have any showers, so this was one of the few ways in which you could keep clean, and we had randomly come across this lake whilst on a routine foot patrol. Frank was the patrol commander, and we'd all agreed that on such a hot summer's day, a swim was in order. However, this would be conducted in a 50-50 split, and whilst half of us went for this refreshing swim, Frank and the remainder of the patrol would provide cover from the high ground close by. As much as I would still like to deny the events that occurred on this day, they have been verified by several other members of 10 Platoon. Once Frank was in position on the high ground, he could clearly see that we were not the only ones using this lake, and that, in fact, it had been used as a dumping ground for bodies. From his elevated position in Overwatch, Frank could clearly see that we were swimming above corpses, and that this lake was a massive war grave. I still deny that this ever happened, or maybe this is just my subconscious protecting me from this memory and the associated trauma. Frank and I, to this day, still continue to agree to disagree on the matter. We would routinely patrol through the main village in the center of Gračanica, which was heavily populated by Serbs. En route to our most eastern vehicle checkpoint, VCP-4, and we were never made welcome. Why would we be? The Serbs who remained in Kosovo perceived us as foreign invaders who were aiding and abetting the KLA, a terrorist group, and they still classed themselves and the regions as Serbian. The residents of Gračanica manned barricades to both the northern and southern checkpoints and the Russians would often accompany us on these patrols. VCP-4 was never dull, and after a while, some of the infantry dismounts had made friends with some of the local girls and were invited to a party. Wade wasn't aware of this and believed that the lads were just going on a routine foot patrol, and I can recall that I was annoyed with him, as Wade had insisted that I stayed with the vehicle. Within just over an hour gone, we heard a bang in the direction of the foot patrol from VCP-4. Wade messaged the patrol on the radio, but we never received a reply. Panic began to set in. Eventually, we were informed that a Serbian sympathizer had thrown a hand grenade at the foot patrol, but had miscalculated their whereabouts and had targeted the wrong window in the flats where they were at. The music was so loud at the house party that the British soldiers were unaware of the grenade attack against them. Fortunately for them, it was the wrong window, and as a result, 2 elderly civilians were injured. Once they became aware of this, they answered us on the radio and quickly extracted to our vehicle, and Wade was none the wiser. Well, that is, until about a week ago, when I informed him of the truth about what the patrol was actually up to that day. Even 22 years later, and despite the fact that I am no longer a soldier, I still sensed his disappointment in knowing that I was aware of this reckless act. On a different day at VCP-4, a car of Albanians sped towards us and slammed on the brakes. 2 men then frantically rushed out of this vehicle with their injured sister, who had a gunshot wound to the face. The 2 brothers had been playing with the pistol, and it had accidentally gone off with deadly consequences. But she was still alive. The closest helicopter landing site, HLS, was on the other side of this Serbian barricaded village, and they would not willingly let Albanians through, which was a sensitive issue that we would have to ignore. We put the casualty in the back of our warrior, and we shot off as fast as we could, aggressively smashing through the barricades in a vain attempt to save this young woman's life. Once we arrived at the HLS, we performed first aid, but she was having unremitting fits and spasms, and fought us at every step. The helicopter ambulance swiftly arrived, and she was evacuated. But we now had to evacuate ourselves, as an angry mob of Serbians was forming around us. The young lady would later die of her wounds, which was really disheartening, as we'd fought so hard to save her. And this was not the only occasion we would encounter the Serbian mob. Then there was the Gračanica riot that we unknowingly and accidentally drove into on return from VCP-4, where we had fixed bayonets. Members of the recce platoon had had weapons stolen by the residents of this Serb village in Gračanica, and had taken it upon themselves to conduct an unauthorized house-to-house search to retrieve them. They'd been successful in recovering their weapons, and had also retrieved some military-grade Soviet-era weapons, but had stirred up a hornet's nest in the process. We had no idea that our recce platoon was even in Gračanica that day, and it was only by pure chance that we were able to rescue them. John Corcoran would always argue against the term rescue, and insisted that we merely assisted them with their safe extraction. Regardless, they were exhausted and about to be overrun by a very angry mob. As soon as we approached, Wade instantly radioed the other vehicles from 10 Platoon for backup, something that maybe the recce platoon should have done as soon as they were overrun. When we arrived, the recce boys were in a ring of steel with bayonets fixed and were being hit with rocks, bottles, bats, and whatever else the Serbs could get their hands on. I revved my mammoth engine and slowly forced my way into the angry crowd. Within moments, the angry mob were like ants swarming a beetle and had climbed on top of my warrior and were hitting Wade and Soldier B with baseball bats. The Serbs were helping themselves to a game of whack-a-mole at Wade and Soldier B's expense. 2 more warriors promptly turned up from 10 Platoon, and they were able to split the crowd, which was now in the region of 200 strong. The dismounts were ordered to fix bayonets and assist the recce platoon, who were now in serious trouble due to fatigue. I genuinely believed that we would have to shoot our way out of this, as the Serbs were barbaric. And it wasn't just the men. It was all of them, including the elderly. Our 20 blades from 10 platoon then aggressively dismounted and attempted to separate the mob from the recce platoon. And this allowed some respite. But now they were bearing the brunt of the mob. This allowed the recce platoon to safely extract on foot with all of their weapons. But we were now fighting for our lives. This was a ferocious riot, and the men of 10 platoon didn't have any riot gear and, as such, were just brawling with the Serbs to avoid being snatched or overrun. This was not how soldiers are traditionally taught to respond in such scenarios. But the brutality of the Serbians' attacks could only be matched with equal violence. The last thing that we wanted was to open fire, but thankfully, the men of 10 platoon were tough, disciplined soldiers, and it never came to that. We then lined the warriors up to block the road, and this allowed us to separate the lads from the mob, and the vehicles took the burden of the riot. Once safely past the barricades, the mob dispersed, and we were able to extract to the factory for some rest and repairs. More riots would follow, especially in the aftermath of funerals, and we would eventually be provided with riot gear, which made managing these situations that little bit easier. Soldier G would experience similar riots in the Serbian bordering town of Podujevo, to the north of Pristina. The Serbian paramilitary group, the Arkan Tigers, had a presence there and were always antagonizing NATO forces and were wanted for war crimes. After a grenade attack in the marketplace, a riot had followed, which left Soldier G and his team of Irish guardsmen overrun, and if it hadn't been for the assistance from the Italian element of NATO, then Soldier G was adamant that they would have been overrun and killed by this guerrilla force. These types of riots were terrifying to be part of and happened all too often, especially surrounding funerals. Both Niall and Frank, as junior commanders, would frequently bear the brunt of these ferociously violent events, whereas I was always safely surrounded by Sheffield steel within the driver's cab of my warrior. I suppose this was a perk of my delayed promotion. The last engagement in Kosovo came when we were living in the Obilic football stadium. I recall that it was the middle of the night, and we were being engaged by sniper fire. We were a skeleton crew, less than section strength. But I was able to locate the firing position and encouraged other guardsmen to accompany me on a stalk. We crawled for over 50 metres, using a nearby concrete wall as cover before reaching the firing point of the sniper, which was a 2-storey building, 10 metres to our left. After a short, quick dash through the open ground, we clinically entered the ground floor of the sniper's building, ensuring that we were covering our arcs and checking the corners before making our way to the stairs. My heart was beating fast, and I switched my rifle to fully automatic as we cautiously made our way up the stairs to the first floor. I wasn't out of breath or tired, but my heart was beating like never before with adrenaline as we cleared each of the upstairs rooms. The sniper had extracted, but his empty cases remained. We had found the firing point, but he or she was still at large. However, this sniper would be someone else's problem, as our time in Kosovo had come to an end. On our return to Germany, no consideration was given towards our poor mental well-being, and no counselling was ever offered for that matter. Post-operational stress management was foreign to the British Army at this time. Soldiers in the 1990s dealt with their emotions like men and drank themselves into oblivion, and this was an accepted practice throughout military culture. I had opted not to fly back with my brothers from 10 Platoon, and instead volunteered to sail back on a ship from the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, with all of the armoured vehicles. This 5-day cruise had given me time to reflect on our time in Kosovo. However, despite my best efforts, I was still reliving that day in the morgue. I was having difficulty processing all of the needless death, the very worst of what mankind has to offer, with all of the ethnic cleansing that we had witnessed. Over time, most of these horrific memories began to blur and disappear into my subconsciousness. And if it wasn't for my own personal journey, they would have been lost forever. A US State Department report from November 1999 acknowledges that the UN Security Council had received reports that more than 11,000 civilians had been killed and were scattered in 529 reported mass graves and killing sites in Kosovo. Furthermore, 1.5 million Kosovo Albanians were forcibly expelled from their homes, and these were, more often than not, burned to the ground. In total, an estimated 500 Albanian villages were reported to have been destroyed in March 1999 alone. Mass rape of Kosovo women was encouraged by Serbian military commanders, with hotels being used to facilitate this. But these numbers were underreported due to the stigma that is associated with rape within Albanian society. The aftermath of these atrocities, after NATO's intervention, saw some revenge attacks on Serbian villages, with between 200 and 400 residents killed. Nevertheless, after what the Kosovo people had endured, one could easily empathize with them, particularly after the 500 sites of summary executions were found. Today, I still have tremendous difficulty in understanding what happened to the people in Kosovo. We witnessed firsthand ethnic cleansing and the inevitable retribution that followed. I still cannot comprehend the evil that some men, soldiers, men of honour, are capable of doing. These inhumane acts of savagery. One thing always stands out throughout my horrific ordeal, though, and that is the kindness and generosity of the Kosovo people. Even when they had nothing, they would offer us everything, and always made us feel welcome. And this gave me a glimpse of hope for the future of humanity. In the years that followed, I would become distant and machine-like and more withdrawn. I began to drink heavily to the point of blacking out and not remembering the previous evening's events. It was easy to hide my underlying pain, as many other soldiers at the time were doing exactly the same thing. The military machine didn't care, as long as come 0800 hours, you were on parade and ready to put a shift in. After the tour, I finally completed my junior non-commissioned officer cadre and came top out of all the Irish Guardsmen. I had previously accepted a posting to the Army Training Regiment as a personal administration instructor, and I was looking forward to the new challenge. I was offered the opportunity to join the battalion on a centenary trip to South Africa and to complete my next promotional course within a year as a reward for my hard work. The only caveat was that I had to turn down my posting to the UK and remain in the battalion. However, my mind was made up, and I just wanted to get away from everyone and everything that reminded me of Kosovo. My only drive was to remove myself from everything and everyone that reminded me of the true cost of war, the avoidable casualties, the preventable deaths, those mutilated civilians in the Pristina morgue.